I didn't know exactly how yet, but I swore I'd fight them. Not just for me, but for my father, my grandfather, for every calloused hand that worked this land long before Cedar Ridge Estates ever existed. And so, the battle began. They thought I wouldn't notice. While I was away serving my country, the HOA stole my family's land and built 225 homes on it. To them, it was the perfect crime: fake papers, city approvals, and a quick profit. But what they didn't realize was that my family didn't just own the land, we owned the water beneath it. Generations ago, my grandfather built a dam with the Army Corps, securing permanent water rights. Those rights passed down to me, and they were stronger than any HOA contract. When I came home and saw strangers living in houses where my father once taught me to fish, the rage was indescribable. I fought them in meetings, in court, across every table they dared to sit at. But they laughed in my face, confident their lawyers and money would bury me. What they didn't know was that nature was on my side. One heavy rain, one turn of the gate, and their empire of McMansions stood on borrowed time. This isn't just a story about land. It's a story about greed, betrayal, and what happens when a community steals from a man who has nothing left to lose. Let me start from begging. I came back from deployment expecting peace, maybe even a little pride, knowing I had finally closed a chapter of service. But what I found waiting for me was nothing close to peace. It was betrayal. The drive up to my family's land was supposed to feel like coming home. That dirt road, lined with oak trees my grandfather planted decades ago, had always been more than just a road. It was a path to memories: fishing with my dad, building a treehouse that barely stood upright, summer barbecues where cousins ran wild until dark. But as I pulled closer, I froze. Where my father's barn once stood, where the fields stretched open and quiet, I saw rows of houses, cookie-cutter homes packed in tight, with "For Sale" signs planted proudly in the front yards. Driveways poured over land I grew up playing on. Kids rode bicycles over ground my grandfather farmed with his bare hands. At first, I thought maybe I'd taken a wrong turn, but no. I knew this land better than anyone. This was home, and now it was gone. I parked, walked past one of the new homes, and noticed something that twisted my gut. An HOA sign nailed onto a freshly painted fence. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge Estates, proudly managed by Cedar Ridge HOA." That's when the reality sank in. Not only had they built on my family's land, they had organized, branded it, and wrapped it all up with a pretty bow. I tried to keep calm, knocking on doors, asking questions. Most people were polite but confused. They thought they'd bought their dream homes fair and square. Some even apologized when I told them I was the original landowner. But the more I asked, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. Someone had sold what they never owned. When I confronted the HOA president, slick suit, expensive, watch, a man who looked like he'd never missed a golf tee time in his life, he smirked. "If you had a claim," he told me, "you should have taken care of it years ago. Paperwork doesn't lie." Paperwork, that's what he called my family's history. I didn't sleep that night. I pulled out old deeds, survey maps, even letters. My grandfather had saved from the county clerk. The land was ours, passed down generation after generation, always paid for, always maintained. My father worked himself half to death to keep it, even when money was tight. So how had it ended? Up in their hands? The answer came slowly, pieced together from neighbors' whispers and records I dug up at the courthouse. The HOA wasn't just some neighborhood committee. It was a machine, built on shady connections, fake documents, and intimidation. They had friends in City Hall who looked the other way. They had lawyers who could turn lies into legal facts. They had the money to outlast anyone who tried to challenge them. One neighbor finally admitted to me, in hushed tones, that the developers had shown up years ago with papers claiming ownership. When the few locals who remembered my family objected, they were shut down, threatened with lawsuits, hit with endless code violations, bullied into silence. And when construction began, the city inspectors signed off like everything was fine. I was furious, but more than that, I was heartbroken. It wasn't just dirt they stole. It was history. It was legacy. It was the land my father walked barefoot on as a boy, the same land where my mother hung clothes to dry in the summer breeze, where I had buried my first dog under the biggest oak tree. Now, all of it sat under concrete driveways and vinyl siding. I remember standing there at dusk, watching porch lights flicker on, one by one. A neighborhood full of strangers living their quiet suburban lives, completely unaware they were standing on stolen ground. They mowed the grass, waved to each other from driveways, and posted HOA notices on bulletin boards as if they belonged here, as if I didn't exist. That night, I made myself a promise. The HOA thought they were untouchable because they had their fake papers and their lawyers. But I had something they couldn't buy, couldn't forge, and couldn't bribe away. The truth. And I wasn't about to let them bury my family's legacy under asphalt. Walking into that first HOA meeting, I thought I was ready. I had the deeds, the maps, even photocopies of my grandfather's dam agreements that spelled out, in plain black ink, who truly owned the water rights. But the moment I stepped into that crowded room, I realized this fight wasn't going to be won with paperwork alone. The board sat in front like judges at a trial, smug, polished, untouchable. Expensive suits, smug smiles, and not a hint of fear. Behind me, rows of homeowners whispered and stared, half curious, half hostile, as if I were the troublemaker disrupting their peaceful little kingdom. I stood and explained. This land was my family's. It wasn't just property lines on a map. It was where my father taught me to fish, where my grandfather built a dam with his own hands, and where my family had lived for generations. The HOA had no right to it. The chairman leaned forward, folded his hands, and smiled like I was a child who had wandered into the wrong classroom. "Sir," he said, voice dripping with mock sympathy, "you must be mistaken. The deeds are clear. This development was approved by the city. If you have a problem, you'll need to take it up with the courts." Laughter rippled across the board. One woman whispered something to her neighbor, and they both chuckled. I felt my face burn, not from embarrassment but from fury. They weren't just dismissing me. They were mocking my family's history as if it were a joke. I left that night more determined than ever. The courtroom wasn't much better. Their lawyers were sharks, polished, precise, and ruthless. Every time I presented evidence, they twisted it. Every time I spoke, they objected. I wasn't a wealthy man with an army of attorneys. I was a veteran, standing alone against a wall of money. At one hearing, the HOA's lawyer even smirked at me as he argued. "Your Honor," he said, "this gentleman may believe he owns the land, but belief does not equal law. These homes are standing. Families live there, and the city has approved every step." The judge nodded gravely, but I caught the flicker of frustration in his eyes. He knew something was wrong, but his hands were tied by technicalities, by delays, by the sheer weight of the HOA's legal machine. Each hearing dragged on. Each meeting was another humiliation, and the HOA knew it. Back in the neighborhood, I felt the eyes on me. Walking down the street where homes now stood on my stolen land, mothers pulled their children closer. Some neighbors refused to meet my gaze, while others whispered loud enough for me to hear. "That's the guy trying to take our homes. He just wants money. Why doesn't he let it go?" Not everyone was against me. An old man once stopped me outside a grocery store and said, "Son, I know you're right. They tried to run me out too, when I spoke up about their fees. Be careful, they played dirty." But most people were silent. Silence born of fear. The HOA ruled with intimidation. Threats of fines, lawsuits, even foreclosure. no one wanted to risk their home, their savings, their peace, just to stand beside me. So I stood alone. But here's the thing about fighting shadows. They may look larger than life, but they vanish when you shine the right light. Late at night, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by stacks of old maps, legal records, and water rights documents my grandfather had carefully preserved. He must have known, even back then, that this land would be worth fighting for. And the more I studied, the more I realized the HOA's power wasn't as unshakable as it looked. Their arrogance blinded them. They thought the court delays and mocking smiles had broken me. They thought silence from my neighbors meant victory. But what they didn't know was that every smirk, every insult, every whispered lie only sharpened my resolve. Because I wasn't fighting just for myself, I was fighting for my family's name. Weeks turned into months. The HOA meetings became routine. They sneered, I spoke, they dismissed me. I could practically script it myself. But beneath their arrogance, I started noticing cracks. They no longer laughed as freely when I presented documents. They whispered, more among themselves. And at one meeting, when I laid down a copy of the original Army Corps dam agreement, I saw genuine unease flicker across the chairman's face. That was the moment I knew. They weren't untouchable. I walked out of that meeting not with humiliation, but with fire in my chest. The courts might be slow. The neighbors might be silent. But my family had left me more than just land. They had left me a weapon more powerful than money or lawyers, and when the storm clouds began to gather on the horizon, I realized my moment was coming. The night I first stumbled across the old box of documents, I wasn't even looking for answers. Truth is, I was just trying to clear my head. After weeks of shouting matches at HOA meetings after being laughed at in front of neighbors I'd known since childhood, I needed a distraction. I ended up in my father's shed, a place that hadn't been touched since before his passing. Dust covered every corner, and the smell of oil and cedar hit me like a memory I didn't realize I'd been holding on to. Inside, beneath rusted tools and old fishing rods, I found it, a metal box with my grandfather's initials engraved on top. My hands shook when I opened it, not because I expected treasure, but because I wasn't sure I was ready to feel him that close again. But inside was the key I never knew existed. Water rights. Dozens of old papers, some stamped by the Army Corps of Engineers, others signed off by county officials from decades ago. My grandfather wasn't just a landowner. He was the man who helped build the dam that controlled the water flow across miles of countryside. He didn't just own property, he owned the water itself. I sat there for hours, flashlight in hand, reading every page like it was gospel. The language was old-fashioned and legalistic, but one thing was crystal clear. Those rights were passed down, first to my father, and now to me. They weren't up for negotiation. They weren't subject to HOA bylaws. They were ironclad, and suddenly the pieces started clicking together. The HOA could wave around their fake deeds all day long. They could bully me in public meetings, throw lawyers at me in court, even bribe local officials to look the other way. But what they couldn't do, what they would never be able to do, was take away something written into federal law, tied to the very infrastructure that kept their shiny neighborhood alive. For the first time since this nightmare started, I felt power return to my hands. Of course, I didn't just stop at reading the documents. I knew if I wanted to win this fight, I needed certainty. I spent the next several weeks buried in research. Late nights at the public library, phone calls, with environmental lawyers who owed favors to my old military buddies, even trips to the courthouse archives. Every trail I followed pointed to the same conclusion. The HOA had absolutely no defense. In fact, it got worse for them the deeper I dug. Not only were the water rights mine, but the HOA had built part of their development in a way that actually violated state floodplain regulations. They thought they'd cut corners to save money, never imagining the one person who could expose them would come knocking. I can still remember sitting at my kitchen table, papers spread out like a battlefield, map my heart pounding. For months, I'd been fighting uphill against a machine that seemed unstoppable. But now I was staring at a weapon bigger than anything they could throw at me. Nature. But here's the thing about power. Once you realize you have it, you can't rush. You have to be patient, precise. That was something the Army taught me. You don't waste ammo. You don't give away your position. You wait for the perfect moment. So that's what I did. I played it cool. I still went to the HOA meetings, let them sneer at me, let them wave their contracts in my face. I still acted like the desperate homeowner they thought I was. But inside, I was stone. I knew what they didn't. I knew their $1-million homes, their manicured lawns, their gated security. It was all sitting on borrowed time. And time was a funny thing, because while they tightened their grip, nature was loosening it. That year, the rains came heavier than usual. Streams swelled, the reservoir filled higher, and I could hear the dam groaning like a beast waiting to be unleashed. Every drop of rain was another reminder of what I held in my hands. Every storm cloud rolling across the horizon was another nail in the coffin of the empire they had built on stolen soil. And I didn't have to lift a finger. All I had to do was wait. There's a strange kind of calm that comes when you know the tide is about to turn. I'd sit on the porch at night, listening to the rain against the tin roof, imagining the look on their faces when they finally realized what I had been. Holding back. It wasn't just revenge I was planning. It was justice. Pure and simple. They thought their lawyers could bury me. They thought their money made them untouchable. But they forgot one thing my grandfather used to say. You can lie about land, but you can't lie about water. Water always finds the truth. And soon enough, the truth was going to come crashing through their streets. Because once you control the water, you control everything. The storm rolled in like something out of a prophecy. Thick, black clouds pressed down against the horizon, swallowing the late afternoon sun until the world felt trapped in a shadow. The veteran stood at the edge of his family's land, boots sinking into the mud, the roar of the storm growing louder. By the minute. He knew this moment was coming. He'd been patient, painfully patient, waiting for the day nature itself would be his ally. For months, the HOA laughed in his face. They called him delusional, unstable, a bitter old soldier who couldn't accept progress. But progress to them was nothing more than theft wrapped in legal jargon and shiny contracts. They thought the papers they forged made them safe. They thought their money and lawyers made them untouchable. What they never realized was that paper burns, money runs out, and lies crumble. Water, though. Water doesn't ask permission. The storm intensified, the first fat raindrops splattering against his jacket, soaking through in seconds. The veteran walked toward the old dam, his grandfather's dam. It wasn't much to look at anymore. Weathered stone, rusted iron, a relic of another generation. But beneath its worn surface lay power. Not political power, not financial power, real, physical power. The kind that reshapes land, swallows homes, and wipes away everything standing in its path. His hands pressed against the gate's lever. The metal was cold, slick with rain, but familiar. He had studied this mechanism for weeks, rehearsing every movement in his mind. He wasn't acting out of anger, not anymore. This was calculated, legal. The water rights were his, passed down through his bloodline, stronger than any HOA claim. And as the rain poured harder, filling the reservoir behind the dam, he knew there was no turning back. Far below, the suburb sat smugly across his land. Rows of oversized houses with manicured lawns, driveways full of polished SUVs, and backyard decks where HOA members once toasted their so-called victory. Tonight, though, their lights flickered uneasily. The rain was coming faster than their storm drains could handle. Their dream community had always been built on stolen ground, and now the ground itself was shifting. The veteran pulled. The gate groaned in protest, rust grinding against rust, but it moved. Slowly at first, then with terrifying ease. A deafening roar split the air as water surged forward, ripping through the narrow channel, crashing like a beast finally released from its cage. The flood didn't hesitate, didn't question. It simply obeyed gravity, rushing down the slope and into the heart of the HOA's empire. From the hilltop, the veteran could see it unfold. Streets transformed into rivers in seconds. Driveways disappeared beneath swirling torrents. Panicked shouts echoed from every direction. People stumbling through waist-deep water, clutching children, screaming for pets. Cars floated, spinning helplessly. Those shiny decks and polished. Fences snapped like matchsticks, dragged away in the current. And the homes, those proud, towering houses built with arrogance, buckled under nature's wrath. Drywall warped, windows shattered, foundations groaned before finally giving way. One by one, they sank, their interiors swallowed by muddy waves. The HOA board members, once so smug in their tailored suits, were now just people in soaked pajamas, standing in knee-deep water, waving their arms in panic. Their authority, their rules, their threats, all meaningless now. Nature doesn't care about bylaws. The veteran didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He simply watched, silent, as justice carried itself out. This wasn't revenge born of cruelty. It was correction. The land was reclaiming what had always been its own. Neighbors stood on rooftops, shouting over the storm. Some were terrified. Others, those who'd been bullied and extorted by the HOA for years, watched with something else in their eyes. Relief. They weren't rooting for destruction, but they couldn't deny the poetic justice unfolding before them. Minutes felt like hours. The water carved new paths, swallowing everything the HOA thought they owned. The community's pride and arrogance dissolved in muddy waves, and no insurance company, no city council, no clever lawyer could undo it. Finally, the storm began to break. The roar of thunder softened into distant grumbles. The rain slowed to a drizzle, but the damage was done. The suburb was unrecognizable. Streets buried, homes ruined, dreams drowned. The veteran turned from the dam, soaked through, every muscle heavy. He didn't need to look back again. What he set in motion couldn't be stopped. And deep down, he didn't want it stopped. For years they had laughed at him, mocked him, stolen from him. Tonight, the land answered on his behalf. And as he walked back toward the old farmhouse still standing on the hill, his farmhouse, he whispered the words his grandfather used to say whenever a storm passed through the valley. You don't fight water, you respect it. When the water finally receded, what remained didn't look like a neighborhood anymore. It looked like a battlefield. Streets that were once lined with freshly painted homes and manicured lawns were now a swamp of mud, broken timber, and collapsed walls. Cars bobbed like forgotten toys, fences were twisted like wire, and the pristine image of that HOA-controlled suburb was gone forever. For years, the HOA had strutted around like they owned the place. Literally. They had built 225 homes on stolen land, silencing anyone who dared question their authority. They thought their rules, their money, and their lawyers made them untouchable. But one night of truth, one surge of water, stripped away every illusion. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. Homeowners, furious and scared, demanded answers. They wanted to know why their insurance companies were refusing to cover the damage. The truth was ugly. The HOA had built on land they never had the right to touch, cutting corners and hiding behind fraudulent deeds. That meant no protection, no payouts, no safety net. Families who thought they'd found their forever homes were suddenly homeless, victims of the very board they had trusted to protect them. The HOA board members couldn't hide. Investigators swarmed in, uncovering a web of fraud, forged signatures, bribed city inspectors, and backroom deals that explained how the houses had been approved in the first place. One by one, charges piled up: fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, even attempted land theft. What had started as neighborhood politics turned into a full-scale criminal investigation. Neighbors who once kept their heads down finally spoke up. One man admitted the HOA had threatened to fine him into bankruptcy if he didn't stay quiet. Another family revealed they were harassed for months after questioning why property lines kept magically shifting on maps. Some even confessed. They'd been too scared to side with the veteran, worried the HOA would ruin their lives like it had ruined others. But now, with the dam broken and the truth literally washed into the open, people found their voices again. Community meetings that used to be controlled by smug board members turned into fiery gatherings where residents demanded justice. Those who once whispered in fear now shouted in unison. The HOA's reign of intimidation was over, and through it all, the veteran stood quiet, not gloating, not smiling, just watching the pieces fall where they were always meant to fall. For him, this wasn't about revenge in the way the HOA painted it. It wasn't about rage, or spite, or petty satisfaction. It was about legacy. His family's land had been stolen. His father's hard work, his grandfather's history, generations of sweat and memory, wiped away by greed. What he did wasn't destruction. It was reclamation. It was justice. In interviews later, reporters asked him if he felt guilty for opening the dam. He answered simply, "When you build on stolen ground, you should expect the flood." Those words spread quickly, almost like folklore. To some, he was a villain who let hundreds lose their homes, but to many others, especially those who had lived under the thumb of HOA tyranny, he became a kind of folk hero, a man who showed that even the most powerful and corrupt systems could be brought down when someone had the courage to fight back. By the end of it all, the land was scarred. The suburb was gone, and the HOA was dismantled piece by piece through lawsuits and prison sentences. But the veteran finally stood on his family's soil again, not as a victim, not as a soldier, but as a man who had fought the longest war of his life and won. And though the water dried, the lesson remained. Greed always builds on borrowed ground, and justice, like a flood, always finds its way through.